So, in Module 4, we're going to continue to look at ASD and PTSD in regards to the course and causes of these disorders. So, let's go ahead and look at that. In the first page here, let's look at the course of trauma exposure. So, what we see is individuals who suffer from ASD who are more likely to develop PTSD is based on primarily these symptoms, which includes the numbing, the depersonalization, and the sense of reliving the experience. So it's much more likely that you're going to, if you have ASD, that it becomes PTSD if these are some of those symptoms that you're experiencing. Now, we talked about PTSD symptoms generally do diminish over time, even though a third of the people still report symptoms after the trauma. So that's kind of the course. So if you're experiencing the numbing, depersonalization, and the sense of reliving the experience, it's more likely going to be a chronic condition going over well past a month period that you would see with ASD. Now, we also need to look at things like social factors that can play a role. And so the victims of trauma are more likely to develop PTSD when the trauma is more intense, it is life-threatening, and it involves greater exposure. And this makes sense. Almost anything is going to have a more powerful effect if it was intensely done and it was done over a long period of time where you're threatened in some way, in the fact that you feel like you're going to die or at very, very high risk of significant harm to your body. So after the trauma occurs, one of the important things to have, and we've talked about this in some of our other chapters, is that social support. And the more social support, it can really play a crucial role in alleviating this long-term kind of psychological damage. So if you ever wondered why people keep harping on the power of friends and having a good social network and trying not to feel isolated and lonely, this is one of those reasons. Social support is one of the major buffers and even possible, well, really major buffers to help with trauma and a lot of life's ups and downs. And it is one of the key factors in what we call resilience. So social support is key, and it's important for you to remember who you think you can depend on if you do need some help. And then don't just sit there and expect people necessarily to come to you. Reach out to people, because a lot of times people may not know what to do if somebody has experienced a trauma. And they may feel a little uncomfortable. I don't know what exactly I should say. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And so if you are a trauma survivor, reaching out can be kind of that window for friends and other people to provide that social support for you, which can then help you out as far as reducing the overall symptomology. Okay. There are biological factors. So we know that there are genetic factors that contribute to PTSD, particularly to the arousal and anxiety, or what we call the sympathetic system. And so what we see there is that you just have a lot more kind of higher arousal, which can lead to that re-experiencing. Okay. So there are some genes that are going to make it more likely for you to have PTSD based on these kind of sympathetic nervous system arousals and kind of fear. And then there are genes that make it less likely. But once PTSD occurs, if those genes have been unlocked, then it's going to make you much more high on your kind of arousal and especially your fear response sensitivity. In other words, when you're spotting danger, it makes you a lot more susceptible to kind of overreacting and having your body respond in a very kind of emergency sort of way, even in relatively neutral kind of stimuli are out there. As far as psychological factors, one of the things on the positive side is something called post-traumatic growth. And these are positive changes that are resulting from the trauma. Those who've gone through post-traumatic growth, it's linked with less depression and greater sense of well-being. On the other hand, it can also contribute to some more intrusive and avoidant thoughts But overall, post-traumatic growth is one of those areas in the research on trauma that people have really tried to cling on to because even though we try our best in our society to have people avoid traumatic experiences, as we talked in previous modules, that's going to be very hard to do when you have almost 90% of people experiencing at least one traumatic event. And so once the trauma has happened and we can't reverse it, what can we do to make people stronger and not have kind of live in the shadow of the traumatic event for decades afterwards? And so the focus has really been here on post-traumatic growth. And that's what like therapists will work on in addition to trying to treat some of the symptoms for individuals that have PTSD. Now, with dissociative symptoms, that's going to predict more, not less PTSD. So if you're showing disassociation in relation to PTSD, it's going to be likely that that is going to be a much longer period. So just like we talked about with the symptoms of ASD converting into PTSD, the numbing, the depersonalization, and the sense of reliving experience, then the dissociative symptoms are going to be another key symptom that will predict later on more PTSD, and that it'll be less likely to resolve compared to if people are not showing those type of symptoms. Another kind of significant supporting factor is this value of purpose, and that is the preparedness, purpose, and absence of blame can aid in the coping with trauma. And so people who have a sense of purpose, even after the trauma, whether it's making sure no one else goes through the experience that you go through, making sure there's enough therapy for others, or something where you are not going to be defeated by this, that you develop a purpose beyond the trauma. That's that value of purpose. And when people have value of purpose, that's going to really bode well for their eventual recovery because it gives you a goal to work towards. Okay. As far as some other key psychological factors, Edna Foa came up with this three key steps of emotional processing. And what she said is that victims have to engage emotionally with the traumatic memories. So remember, with trauma, people tend to want to avoid that, avoid the thoughts, avoid the places, avoid the situations that they associated with the traumatic memory. And according to FOA, that to truly be able to process these emotions, you have to engage in them again, even if they are a bit painful. The second step is that victims need to find a way to articulate and organize that chaotic experience. And so it can be hard. We even talked about almost as a protective measure that memories of the traumatic event are not necessarily seen as a typical memory, and that some things are going to really stand out, but other things are going to kind of be blocked out, maybe because of the trauma. And it can be so that you almost retreat into another part of your brain and not really being able to give words to what the experience is. But it's so necessary to be able to do that to finally get through the emotions and kind of what the full impact is in regards to the traumatic event. And then finally, victims have to come to believe that even though they had trauma, the world is not a terrible place. So we've talked about, when we looked at anxiety and mood disorders, about the cognitive processing and having those repetitive thoughts and what that can drive people to actually feel. Like I'm no good, that would be more of a mood disorder, or thinking like something like, I don't think I'm going to be able to do it, could result in some sort of anxiety. And so if you think continually the world is an awful place, there will be plenty of instances where you can always confirm that kind of perspective, but it limits you. It doesn't allow you to go on with your life because you're always in this kind of fearful mode that everything is dangerous, when that's not true about everything in the world. And so those are the three key steps that Edna Foa kind of talked about in regards to emotional processing. And then the last psychological factor that we're going to discuss here is meaning making. In other words, finding some sort of value or reason for having endured the trauma. And this is going to be a very personal type of experience, and it may involve religion, and believing a God has, put you to survive this, to help others, or to, be able to do the thing that you were meant to do. It could be a renewed application for life. So, I didn't truly appreciate everything I had before the trauma, but now that I've experienced that, this world appears brand new. Or even getting involved in public service, realizing that, looking out for yourself and just doing things for yourself is not a fulfilling way to go. And that now that there's been a second chance, that you've kind of gotten through this, that now you can have some meaning in your life. So that, and along with emotional processing, having lots of social support, and a value of purpose, all of these can really be a positive contributor to diminishing any symptoms of PTSD, and maybe even avoiding it altogether and just having maybe the acute stress disorder. Now, in most cases, ASD and PTSD develop as a result of a combination of the factors that we've been discussing throughout this module and our last one in Module 3. So the trauma itself, okay? Certainly, depending on what that trauma is, it can predict more or less likely for PTSD. As you remember on that initial slide, I believe it was back in Module 3, where you saw something like sexual assault is particularly damaging, or really getting beaten up badly, are much more likely to result in a trauma or PTSD than some of the others. There are personality characteristics that can predate trauma. So we talked about the existence of mental health disorders are a couple of the things that could contribute. And then you also have some of your genetic propensities on making it maybe more likely or less. Your exposure during the trauma. So, once again, trauma is not always experienced directly. Sometimes it is just witnessed. So if you look at the picture up there at the top, that is something of a witnessing of maybe a domestic abuse or something. And then emotional processing and social support afterwards. So all of the things before, you've got the before characteristics that you bring into a traumatic event. You have the traumatic event itself, how much exposure you've had, the intensity, the duration, all of that. And then finally, you have the after. The after is how well you can emotionally process, the social supports that you have in place. And if you're able to have the after and have the supports that you need, then that would predict hopefully less likelihood of full-blown PTSD, or that the symptoms diminish fairly quickly. So for most people that experience trauma, resilience is the most common outcome. And by resilience, what we mean is the ability to overcome that trauma and not necessarily develop a full-blown disorder. So that kind of gives an overview of some of the causes and outcomes of PTSD and ASD. We're going to go a little bit more in depth in Module 5 to talk about the treatment for these disorders. So go ahead and stay tuned for that one.